Many skeptics of the Bible, for example Bart Ehrman, claim that the Gospel of Matthew could have not been written by Matthew. One of their ways, or their claims to posit this, is saying that the Gospel of Matthew was written in third person. Thus, it's highly unlikely that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, as he would be describing himself in third person. Now, this would be a fair claim to the modern reader, as the modern reader is not going to write themselves in third person. You're normally going to write yourself in first person. You're going to write yourself as I did this instead of he did this or, she did this. It's a little strange sounding. And however, this claim is of course not new, as a saint literally debunked it about 1,000 years ago, believe it or not. In a work by Hipponaceus, he writes this: Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew was not the writer of his gospel, because, when speaking of his own election, he says not, he saw me and said to me, follow me, but he saw him and said to him, follow me. This has been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as not to have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of himself, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself, in the hope of getting hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It is needless to resort to other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane authors for the information of our friends and for the refutation of Faustus. We find examples in the passage quoted above from Moses by Faustus himself, without any denial, or rather with the assertion that they were written by Moses, only not written of Christ. So to clarify what that massive quote is saying, is that Hipponaceus is noting that people sometimes, very rarely of course, but sometimes people will write about themselves in the third person, for example how Moses did in Genesis, and we have more examples of this. Not just from Hipponaceus' example, for example in the book by Josephus, The Jewish War. Josephus also writes himself in third person strangely, as he writes, he who had the first lot laid his neck bare to him that he had the next, as supposing that the general would die among them immediately, for they thought death, if Josephus might die with them, was sweeter than life. We see that they're referring to Josephus in third person, but Josephus is writing this, so we have another example of this. Then once again we have an example from the historian Xenophon, who did the same exact thing. As he writes, there was a man in the army named Xenophon, an Athenian, who was neither general nor captain nor private, but had accompanied an expedition because Proxenus, an old friend of his, had sent him home an invitation to go with him. Once again he's writing about himself, but in third person. So to conclude, there's no reason to think that Matthew did not write his gospel because he wrote it in third person, as we have plenty of examples of people who did it as well, for example Moses, Josephus, and Xenophon.